Hello, everyone. This is Rob Orson with Emerging Revolutionary War. I am happy to be here with Dr. Susan Brynne Long. Welcome, Brynne. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
Brynne is at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where she teaches early American history and military history. Lots of research on American Revolutionary War. Brynne I've met through the George Washington Roundtable here in near Mount Vernon, and she's done lots of talks in the United States Army Museum. So we have lots of common friends and connections, and it was great to see some of the research that you've been doing. That I think is something that people really haven't touched on in a while.
Mhm.
Um, and so the title of this podcast was kind of basically off of your recent paper that you're working on, The Disagreeable Situation, American Prisoner of War Administration in the Revolutionary War. And we're going to dive a little bit more into that paper. But if you can kind of just give us a brief overview, and that's always hard to do that as a historian, but let's talk about the prisoner of war situation in the American Revolution, how the Americans handle it. I think a lot of our viewers will know about the prison ships in New York Harbor and in Charleston Harbor as well. Maybe some people might know about the Hessians and the Saratoga Convention Army prisoners, but kind of give us a situation. How are the Americans handling prisoners of war as the war starts in 1775?
Yeah, thanks for that great lead up. I feel like you've teed it up perfectly because you're 100% right. Sort of traditionally, the focus has been on Americans in British captivity and the brutalities of that. And maybe to give a little peek behind the curtain, I'll offer this, which is when I wanted to go to grad school and do PhD in history, it was, you need to find something nobody had done before. And so that's kind of how I got on this side of things. But essentially, the Americans, they capture about 17,000 British Allied prisoners during the course of the Revolution. And that's a number I get from another recent work on this topic by T. Cole Jones. His book, Captives of Liberty, is very good on the violence of the Revolution, violence committed towards British Allied prisoners. But when I say that, of course, I refer to those German auxiliaries as well as the British prisoners. So loyalists I consider separately, and most people who do this work consider those loyalists separately. The way that Americans administered those 17,000 prisoners of war during the conflict started out as a very ad hoc thing, which is, obvious to you probably, Robin, to many of the listeners, right? The colonies are still trying to figure out how to be states in 1774, 1775, when we see the first sort of minor skirmishes and engagements with British troops who have been stationed in the colonies, as a way to try to stop this revolution from getting out of hand and from progressing. So when prisoners are captured, for example, in Massachusetts in 1775 with Lexington and Concord, that's something where very small prisoner groups are being handled by the Massachusetts revolutionary authorities on a very case by case basis. And it's really going to continue on an ad hoc case by case, situation to situation type process until we get to Trenton and Princeton, with the capture of larger prisoner groups. And this is where Washington becomes aware that this is probably an element of the revolution that deserves more attention and more organization. So he begins to pressure John Hancock and Congress to formalize some sort of administrative system for prisoners. He is ultimately successful in this. He is able to get Congress to create what's called the Department of Prisoners in 1775. And then he gets to appoint the first Commissary General of Prisoners. He chooses Elias Boudinot, who was a New Jersey lawyer who had a lot of experience in New Jersey colonial politics and then later revolutionary politics. And Elias Boudinot is given a bunch of deputies by Congress who also receive ranks in the Continental Army. And those are going to be his deputies. So there's this constant sort of tension between Boudinot and Congress and the Board of War about really who has authority over prisoners. He feels that, given the terms of his appointment, which was effectuated by Washington himself, he should have ultimate authority over prisoners. But again, this system really isn't formalized until 1777 when he's appointed. And a lot of the state governments that are now quite well and truly operational and have been operational for a couple of months, if not years, by the time Boudinot was given his appointment by Congress, they don't want to relinquish control of prisoners. And so this is where my work enters, is to look at the delineation between civil and military authorities over prisoners, and how, whose authority that you're falling under is going to affect your experiences as a captive. So that's kind of a broad overview of it. Elias Boudinot is the first Commissary General of Prisoners. We get two, maybe three more, depending on the way that you consider the last tenure. But that is an organization that, at least nominally, legally has authority over prisoners. And in reality, they're dispersed across the various states and are largely handled by state and local authorities.
So I was perfect segue what I was about to ask you. So when it comes to feeding prisoners, um, is that falling on the states mostly, or is that falling on the continental, the new federal government, or is that more of a state duty?
So more of a state duty for sure. Yeah, and that's a great question. There's so many different ways that prisoners get fed and get paid for and get handled, and it is something that Boudinot resents, just how much diversity there is in prisoner experiences. Because if we think about this from the perspective of the emergent American Republic, and we think about it in terms of how we understand Washington as a commander and Washington as a political leader, he wants America to not just talk the talk of being a legitimate sovereignty,
Mm.
but to walk the walk. And so he wants the revolution to be conducted in line with 18th century European martial tradition. And this is something that he does not just try to effectuate in the area of prisoner administration. And we're very well versed as historians of early America in the ways in which Washington's trying to professionalize his army, right? Baron von Steuben, in the Blue Book, right? These are things I'm very familiar with. So he attempts to sort of effectuate the same professionalization of prisoner administration. So Washington and others are looking back to the 7 Years' War, even to things like the 30 Years' War, recent conflicts in European history, to see how has France, how has Britain, how has Spain treated enemy combatants. And the answer for the Americans is, we need to treat them according to these humane prisoner standards that have been in place since really the Treaty of Westphalia and the end of the 30 Years' War.
Mhm.
This is not some sort of Geneva Convention list of rules, but rather a set of standards that emerges from a lot of different peace treaties that are signed in the course of the 17th and 18th century, that generally begin to reflect an increased value of human life and increased value of the soldier, whether that soldier is fighting or in captivity. So this includes things like provisions. This includes things like rations. Traditionally in 18th century European warfare, the belligerents would pay for the subsistence of enemy prisoners in their captivity. And then when the war is over, everybody kind of brings their receipts to the table, and this is how much I paid for these prisoners, and so now would you pay that back? And of course, a lot of that repayment is going to be bound up in who won, right?
Mhm.
So with the French and Indian War, the French are going to start to lose the upper hand against Britain in 1758, and then at the end of the war, Britain has all these debts, or these payments that they've made to pay for French prisoners in British captivity, and they expect the French king to pay that back. By the end of the 7 Years' War, the French are well and truly in debt, and so whether that money actually gets back into the hands of the belligerents is another question. But anyway, it's a very long way of saying that Congress and Washington, they want to do the same thing. They want to keep very strict order and records of how much the states are paying for prisoners, how much those lodging and accommodations is going to cost, how much the rations are costing, and they will ask the states to keep track of those things very closely and then submit their receipts to later be submitted to Great Britain during peace negotiations. But this is something that happens very haphazardly, again, very much on a state-by-state basis. And then, of course, there's all the post-war debates between Hamilton and Jefferson about whether or not the federal government should assume the debts of the states, the wartime states, state debts, of which prisoner expenses are a part. And what we ultimately see in the end is that the burden for paying for prisoners and their needs falls disproportionately on the states where prisoners stay during the war. So places like Massachusetts, places like Pennsylvania, really not as much in the southern states because we're not as victorious in the southern states as we are in the
Right.
northern states. So that's sort of a very long answer, but I hope gives some sort of sense about how confused all of this is and how state by state specific it ends up becoming.
I think it's fascinating to think about the states doing it. I'm not sure how many people watching would know that, and how that became part of the discussion after the war about selling these debts.
Yeah.
Um, and also love your point about Washington. Basically, the way I feel it, is legitimate humane treatment of prisoners of war provides this government some legitimacy on the world stage, right? Always seeking for, Washington's been seeking for respect his whole life, right?
Mhm.
So it's a way I think that they're showing that, we are a civilized country on the world stage, and treatment of prisoners is a big part of that. Um,
And it's the opposite for the British, right? Because for them, it's, how do you strike this balance between heads on pikes, right? Like, how do you, traitors to the empire, Scottish and Irish
mhm,
rebellions of the mid 18th century, and treating them like legitimate combatants? Because to treat Americans according to 18th century standards of warfare is to concede the point of American independency. That is to say, you're not a traitor, you are just as legitimate a combatant as the French were in the 7 Years' War. So this is another thing that complicates the question of repayment, is that the British are never going to treat Americans with the same sort of care and attention to humanity and humane policies as the Americans will. And so Washington, even though he starts with this, let's treat them well, let's walk the walk, let's earn our place among the powers of Europe, right? He is a vengeful person once he starts seeing the way that Americans are being treated in those ships with which we
right.
began, Rob, that you draw our attention to, because he starts hearing those reports. Elias Boudinot, his commissary general of prisoners, is taking, depositions and testimonies from men who have come out of the HMS Jersey, and Washington says, this is unacceptable. We have to
Mhm.
start retaliating against British ally prisoners. Now, he never really does that. Washington tends to be a lot of bark and not as much bite. But his general sentiments about the extent to which Americans should treat British ally prisoners humanely definitely shift and change over the course of the war.
Right. And also too briefly, I'm sure everyone watching knows this, but we're basically talking about enlisted men here, not the officers. The officers, just real quick, talk about what would happen to an officer when captured.
Yeah, so officers on the whole are going to have a better experience of captivity than enlisted men. It's not true in every case, because the other piece that we have to think about with officers, of course, is that sometimes they're useful political bargaining chips, right? So think about not an officer, but even a higher ranking person or a better known person, like somebody like John Lawrence, right, or Henry
Mhm.
Lawrence rather, in captivity, is going to have their own unique set of circumstances, given that so much diplomatically and politically is riding on their captivity. Or if you think about somebody like Charles Lee, when he's in captivity, which there's a lot to think about there, just in terms of the added pressure of that person's experiences. Ethan Allen also, when he's captured during the Canadian campaign, there's a lot of political and diplomatic attention on what happens to him in captivity, kind of becomes something of a bargaining chip. So I would say there's pros and cons to being an enlisted person versus being an officer, because at least if you're enlisted, you can kind of, like, you have this level of obscurity that you don't have as an officer. There's not as much attention.
Right.
But still, overall, on the whole, officers will have better experiences in captivity than enlisted men. Um, Initially, in the early years of the war, when there is still a drive for and resources for giving officers some sort of like money, we see that Congress does give some money to the Trenton officers, for example, that they can spend with the expectation that they would repay it once they are free from captivity. So you might get some sort of stipend or allowance, either from a state government or, as I said, from Congress during the early years of the war. Um, with that money, you can book yourself private accommodations, so you can live in more comfortable housing than you would be afforded as an enlisted person. Another benefit that officers had was parole. Parole meaning, in this case, that you would be given a circle of area, a circle location where you can walk freely and move freely in this space. So it might be like a 3 mile sort of area around your house that you're boarding in, right? You can go freely in that area. You might have a curfew, you have to be in by night or something like this. But in general, officers, the idea is, on their honor, they will swear that they won't try to escape, that they'll stay within this predetermined location. And that's not something that we see enlisted people getting nearly as often. So those things are things that are actually given to officers by state, local, and the national authority during the war. Officers also, though, just have an elevated financial ability to better their circumstances, whether or not they're getting that allowance from Congress or from whoever. And so officers will frequently be using their own money to buy themselves more food, to buy themselves better accommodations, or to maintain the trappings of gentility in captivity, right? And we see this across all the different areas where prisoners are held during the war. So that's the officer's experience. Enlisted people is different. We see that, again, Washington, nobody wants to treat them poorly. So they're not going to be put in jails. That's not something that, Washington wants to have on his conscience or on his public persona. So instead, prisoners are hosted in communities throughout early America. Oftentimes, those communities will construct barracks to be able to receive prisoners. So barrack structures pop up across New England and the Mid-Atlantic to be able to receive large prisoner groups, again, with a large concentration in Massachusetts and a very large population in Pennsylvania, centered around Lancaster County. So those barracks, though, fill very quickly, and there's not exactly the money to be able to, or the manpower, because we're in the middle of a war, to keep making these barracks. And so increasingly enlisted men will be allowed to work for their subsistence, and they will be allowed to have sort of a similar situation that officers were afforded, where they can go to their employer and work during the day, but they have to report back to the barracks at night, or maybe their employer is providing them with accommodations where they're staying. And that's really going to depend on the skills of prisoners and what sorts of labor demands exist in a particular community. So in a place like Lancaster, there's a lot of farms that are missing, their
Right.
young men. And so people who have those sorts of skills will be able to be employed. There's like ironworks as well. What is it? What's in Carlisle? What were they producing in Carlisle? I'm forgetting. The name is like escaping me.
I wasn't ready for that question.
It's okay. They're producing a lot of military armaments is essentially
Right.
what's happening. So like with Trenton, for example, there's a couple Trenton prisoners who are gunsmiths, and they end up working to produce guns, which is not something that we would think of necessarily. Why would you want the enemy to be making guns for you? But again, there's this idea that they're auxiliaries, they're not super into the British cause, so
Right.
let's trust them. There are a few instances I found where uh, Congress or a state authority became aware of a locality allowing prisoners to train militiamen and train, Continental Army recruits essentially, and they
Interesting.
put a stop to that right away. And so there's definitely limits to sort of what you can do, what you can be employed to do, but
Mhm.
the communities are not particularly interested in Congress's vision for a civilized war effort. Communities are interested in not having their coffers drained to pay for these prisoner populations.
Right. And there's a story of the Hessians that a lot of those Hessians stay back,
Mhm.
especially in Pennsylvania. There's a lot of families that can trace their lineage back there in central Pennsylvania to a Hessian prisoner that just decided it was a good place to stay.
Yeah, well, and they intermarry sometimes too. That
Yep.
that
Mhm.
happened with Trenton prisoners where, they get word like, okay, we're gonna exchange you now. And it's like, nope, so and so is married a local woman. So that happens as well. There's interpersonal elements of this too. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the more famous, at least here in Virginia, obviously I'm very Virginia focused, being in Virginia, but with officers is William Phillips, who spends so much time with Jefferson at Monticello, and
Yeah.
they share all these stories, and then it gets exchanged, and then Jefferson, it almost has his feelings hurt that Phillips is running around Southern Virginia, and burning farms and being a military officer, and Jefferson's very upset that, wait a minute, this guy's a nice guy. We had a friendship. It's
And yeah, yeah, and Fun Leaders as well, was
right.
also at Charlottesville. And actually, that gives me a chance to talk about the women, because women often in early modern European warfare and in the Revolution were offered the choice: do you want to go with your husband or into captivity or no? And von Liedezel's wife, Charlotte, says that she does want to go. And so she is with him during his captivity in Charlottesville, but they're also moving around a lot. And so, if you're a camp follower, or if you are on the strength of the regiment, and you are in a situation where your husband gets captured, frequently that choice will be offered. But I would say the counter argument is, what choice is that really? Could you really say no to that if you're in a foreign
Right.
land and you know, you have no way of you have no roots there, no way of making
Yep.
money, right? So a lot of women do make the choice to follow their husbands into captivity. And this can sometimes be used as a way to leverage employment opportunities, because employers start to realize that if a man who's been, you know, put into captivity has a wife with him and children with him, he's much less likely to escape because they know
Oh
that
yeah.
he's got
Right.
those roots. So, and you see that in letters where these men are appealing to local state authorities for the opportunity to go work for their subsistence. And they literally say, my wife is here, my child is here. Yeah, I'm not going to leave. Right. And that's used as proof essentially of like, I'm not going to run away.
Well, you must have seen my notes because I was going to ask about wives of prisoners, and you went right to it. So because it's something people don't think about, right? Like a lot of these officers had their significant others with them. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
they make a good point. They had to make a decision. And so, I think going with is probably makes more sense practically when you think about it, you know.
Yeah, and enlisted wives too. There's a really interesting letter in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where Lancaster had taken in prisoners from the fall Canadian campaign of 1775. So these would have been prisoners taken from Fort St. John, Fort Crown Point, and these women and children, right? I mean, those are garrisons. And so even more so than just a battlefield campaign, right? Like those garrisons were domestic spaces just as much as they were militarized spaces, because you know, people live there with their families. And so these prisoners go to Lancaster, and Lancaster's providing for them, but also are constantly writing to the Pennsylvania Revolutionary Authority saying, what do we do with these prisoners? And then Pennsylvania turns around to their delegates in Congress and says, what do we do with these prisoners? And Congress has a million things on its plate in 1775, none of which are prisoner administration.
Right. Prisoner, yeah, concerns about prisoners, right.
Exactly. And it's a fairly small prisoner group too. I mean, it's only a couple hundred, it's like 150, I want to say. And so Congress is not, you know, there's sort of occasionally sending missives out about like, you know, this officer can have this parole or this officer can have this allowance, but there's not a lot of information coming down from Congress. So Lancaster has to decide what to do. And I found this excellent note in the journals of the Lancaster Committee of Safety where it said the people were so moved by seeing women and children freezing and
Mm.
hungry from the Canadian campaign that they raised money and raised like they gathered together mattresses and blankets to be able to just like make sure that the women and children were not cold in the winter, right? And there's a lot of that in the conflict. Like the British, or rather the Continental Army does appoint somebody to be a commissary. So basically somebody to feed and to clothe all of the British prisoners. In 1776, they appoint David Franks, who is a Jewish merchant, I believe from New York or maybe Pennsylvania. Anyway, David Franks, he is technically supposed to be the one who is rationing everybody, but he's not getting money from Congress or Britain to do what he's doing. He's pretty much doing all of this on credit. He's assuming the cost of this. And
Wow.
before he can ever have his accounts settled, and all of his account books are at the Library Company of Pennsylvania, would highly recommend. Very interesting to see how he tries to sort of provision this ever-growing number of prisoners without any aid from either government. The Americans arrest him because they think he's a spy. And so, so that he's not replaced, you know. So from then on, it's going to very much come down to the Department of Prisoners and to these individual localities to care for prisoners.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. I mean, there should be a book about all this, right?
There should be.
Um, so we were talking before we went on, start recording about a little bit about, and it's in your paper too, about British-born prisoners and American-born, the British allies. We call them loyalists, but how is the treat? Is there any? I mean, I know you're going to dive into this a little bit about in South Carolina, but generally speaking, is there a big difference? I would think most people would think there'd be a big difference in how you would treat your neighbor who you might see as a traitor or as someone that is coming from, Wales, that's their job as a soldier, right? So is there generally speaking, you see a general pattern of different treatment between the two?
Yes, great question. Loyalists are definitely not treated as well as British Allied prisoners. People born in Wales, people, or the Germans, right? People born in Hesse-Kassel or in Ireland even, right? So there's not as much sympathy for people who are seen by those of a patriot persuasion as having, defied the cause or as undermining the cause. And when we think about prisoners in the American Revolution, I've certainly encountered this a lot. I frequently get people who say, well, oh yeah, like the prison ships. And I say, yeah, and you know what? We had those too. We actually had ships that the Patriots put loyalists on in Boston. And
Hmm.
so but that's not something that happens to prisoners of war. Now, it's not that prisoners of war can't end up in jails. They can, but that would be as a punishment for them, breaking the rules while they are allowed on parole or while they're allowed to work for a local inhabitant or what have you. So it's a punishment thing. It's not something that they get by default. Whereas loyalists are going to be, of course, brutalized by committees of safety. And then when they're in prison, they will go into jails. One thing I've noticed is that in the North, there is this very intentional desire that I see reflected in the journals of these revolutionary governments to keep a clear distinction between state prisoners, referring to loyalists, and
Hmm.
military prisoners, referring to prisoners of war. And I think at least part of that is financial, because again, there is this expectation that at some point, hopefully, the states will get refunded, reimbursed for the money that they spend on military prisoners, whereas loyalists, state prisoners, are conceived of as having committed treason against the state, right? You're
Right.
against Pennsylvania or you're against New York or what have you. So there is this very intentional element of like you're a state prisoner or you're a military prisoner, and this becomes very interesting when you start getting into the correspondence of prisoners themselves, because frequently they will contest their own classification. And you'll get people who are loyalists or have been classified as loyalists rather, who are petitioning and asking that they would be considered as a prisoner of war. And there are various pieces of evidence that they will put forward in their own support, whether it be that they had enlisted in the British Army, that they were not born in the colonies. Um, you know, this evidence is to us that not only can we look back and see the difference between, being a loyalist and how you'd be treated and then being a prisoner of war, but the people themselves who got caught up in the revolution were acutely aware that if you were classified as a loyalist, you were in for a rough time. Whereas if you're a prisoner of war, at least in the early years of the war, you were going to have certain protections that you got to sort of get protected by, right? And so there's several prisoners who will contest their own classification and are militant about holding on to their enlistment papers, any sort of service record that they have, because they know that if they get misclassified, that's going to be the only thing that might release them from a jail and put them into a barracks or put them into a host community where they will have a better chance of being treated well. Again, not in every case. And there is, I would say, and T. Cole Jones talks about this in his book too, there's a declension over time. And I think prisoners on the whole do better in the early years of the war. British Allied prisoners do better in the early years of the war than the later years of the war, partially because of money, partially because of, frayed feelings between the British and the Americans. Are just, things get very, viscerally violent between the two belligerents. But yeah, prisoners themselves don't want to end up being classified as loyalists because they see what that looks like. And frequently, the patriot authorities are trying to keep those two groups separate as well because they want to make sure they get their money back for taking care of military prisoners.
Right. Well, some of your most recent research I know you're working on is dealing with some things in South Carolina in 75 and 76. The Fort Charlotte. I don't want to call it the fight at Fort Charlotte because there's really not a fight, but the capture of Fort Charlotte in July of 75. And then the snow campaign, which we're getting close to the 250th that right now, November, December of 1775. And you kind of dive into this, if you can talk about a little bit in the paper that you're working on about how the prisoners are kind of, that loyalist, that dichotomy between the loyalists and the patriots or Whigs or however you want to call them, and these different various actions. And 96 too plays into that too. So
Mhm.
big question for you to kind of give me an overview of, but but
Yeah, and
but I mean, you cover it so well in what you're researching. I think it's interesting for people to hear about what you're finding out because I think it doesn't go against what the pop. I think it goes against the popular thought of what people would think was going on early in the war in the backcountry of South Carolina.
yeah, I appreciate it. And Rob, you know me, I'll talk for hours, so cut me off when.
Roll on, now you go.
Um, I didn't really realize you mentioned this is against the sort of common thought about the backcountry war, and I knew that, but I didn't know how much against the grain this paper was going to be until I presented it at a conference recently.
Mhm.
And I realized that in early American historiography, I'd say about 10 years ago, everyone responded to this call. I think it was by Holger, I'm going to look up his name because I don't want to get it wrong. Um, this is the benefits of doing this online because I can, yes, okay. Holger Hawk, and he's a historian who wrote a book called Scars of Independence. And his call in that book was that we need to think about the revolution as a war and we cannot keep sanitizing it. And he wasn't the first person to make this call, but he's certainly the one that, in all of our historiographies and our introductions, we're all citing that and saying, here, now I'm answering, look how violent it was. T. Cole Jones's book, which I just talked about earlier, was certainly an answer to that call to make the revolution violent again, and to actually pay attention to the brutalities that were endured, for example, by loyalists, but also by prisoners of war. And I do agree with his overall contention that there is a declension that occurs in the treatment of prisoners, and that your experiences as a captive get worse. If you're captured in 1775, you'll be mostly fine. But by the time you get to, you mentioned earlier, the conventioneers captured under Burgoyne at Saratoga, they have a truly horrific experience of captivity, and they are moved from place to place to place without food, without resources, and a lot of them do die. And I think that's true. However, what early American historians are now arguing about is, you know, if it was so violent, because everybody answered this call robustly, and now we have all these texts and all these articles about how violent the war was in a variety of areas, not just prisoner administration. If it was so violent, why not the French Revolution? Why not rivers of blood? And this is something my students ask me in the classroom because we do America, we do France, and then we do Haiti. And so they look at this and they say, well, why did the guillotine not become a thing in the American Revolution? And I remember presenting this work a long time ago when I was just getting started on it to a friend of mine. And he said, why didn't they just kill the prisoners? And this was like somebody who was getting their PhD in European history. And it just like, it clicked for me. I was like, oh, I mean, there's, that's just, it just wouldn't happen in the
Mhm.
American context. At least I think that. And this is sort of the great divide in early American historiography right now, is whether you think the revolution was ultimately a restrained conflict or a horrifically bloody one. And I think it can be both, but generally I fall more on the side of restraint prevailed. And I think that's what this work on South Carolina reveals, because when we think about the backcountry of the American Revolution, we think about blood. And we think
Right.
about the killing and executing of prisoners and no quarter, and we think about all of the partisan fighters, Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, just going hog wild, right? And I thought to myself, well, I wonder whether I could go into the archives and find a different story, or if there is a different story. And I did. I found a different story. So 1775, South Carolina, familiar story, Civil War, right? And there's loyalists and patriots fighting on the backcountry, largely fighting around the region of 96. And the snow campaign is a part of that. And what happens in the lead up to, well, let me back up. So in 1775, when the South Carolina patriots overthrow the extant royal government and establish a revolutionary government, that government is almost immediately invested in creating policies for the humane administration of prisoners, which is
Mhm.
surprising. And it really kind of upsets our traditional views of, again, the backcountry, because we think
Right.
about prisoners just being subject to violence. But yes, in 1775, the capture of Fort Charlotte is sort of the first moment where we see the Patriots waging an offensive against loyalists in the backcountry. There is a garrison of men there. They, according to my research, and I couldn't really find anything about them, but Evidence suggests they were most likely just released right away by Major James Mason, who was the commanding officer in that attack. Then we flash forward to the snow campaign, and about 130-ish prisoners are captured in the course of that campaign. They will be sent back to Charleston or towards Charleston by Colonel Richard Richardson and also by Andrew Williamson. And upon their arrival there, Williamson is essentially defensive of their state. And he says, they look really bad. These loyalists look really bad, but it wasn't me. Like, they were out on campaign for several months before, we were victorious against them at Great Canebrake. So this is not us. This is just the fact that they were already on campaign. And that was really interesting to me because it's evidencing that, he, as a military commander, as a militia officer, he is immediately trying to protect his reputation because he knows it will be damaged if the presumption with the arrival of these prisoners is that he did anything to them, right? So there's nothing at that point on the records. There's nothing in the proceedings of the South Carolina Provincial Congress that says, like, treat prisoners humanely. But we know that that was an expectation of his conduct by him writing this letter that says, they already looked pretty bad when I got to them, right? And so that sort of is I would say is indicative of the overall pattern in 1775, 1776 South Carolina politics, which is to conduct themselves honorably. And it's not just in the administration of white prisoners, but it's also in the administration of indigenous prisoners. Andrew Williamson, who I mentioned earlier, and who's involved in the Snow Campaign, he is also involved in a series of joint campaigns with Continental Army soldiers and also Lower South militiamen who are attacking Cherokee settlements on the frontier. He writes a letter to John Rutledge, who's president in South Carolina at this time. He says, I'm trying to incentivize men to join this campaign. We need to disarm the Cherokee. Could we imprison, or could we enslave, rather, the Cherokee
Mm-hmm.
prisoners that we capture? And John Rutledge writes back and says that this would be harmful to the honor of the state. This would paint the state in a bad light to do it. He's also worried about essentially retaliatory actions by the Cherokee, where it would be possible that South Carolinians would be enslaved by the Cherokee as retaliatory effort if Williamson were to begin enslaving his captives. And so instead, what Rutledge comes to suggest and what is adopted by the South Carolina Authority is a very familiar sort of compensation schedule for Cherokee prisoners and Cherokee scalps, which of course had a lot more precedent in colonial America than the outright enslavement of Indigenous Americans. And so, of course, still horrific to our 21st century sensibilities. But if you're thinking about it in terms of where there was precedent and where there wasn't, John Rutledge understands that for him to allow Williamson to begin enslaving prisoners of war would be so offensive to extant precedent between South Carolina and Cherokee that this would result in harm done to South Carolinians and harm done to the honor of the state, which is not something that he wants. So I just say that to say there's definitely evidence of attempts to moderate approaches to prisoner administration, and I don't think that's normally what we think about when we think about South Carolina and the war.
Right. And back to Cherokee, and you took my question away from me, so that's fine.
Great minds.
That was right there next. No, I think it is interesting, his decision, but I think you have a good point there. I think, obviously he's worried about the honor, but I think it's retaliation he's worried about too.
Yeah.
Because, he sees the war's going to end eventually. They're going to have to they want to, we know they want to expand west, right? And they're going to run into more Cherokee, and they're going to run into other tribes. So they're going to have to figure out, that's the history of our country moving west, right? Always trying to figure out a way. But I think not enslaving them is, I think that retaliatory part that you mentioned is probably a good motivator for him as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
And because, the Whigs are patriots living on the frontier, they're under a constant attack. They may turn to the British for protection, right? And then you have a whole, South Carolina is such a weird place, isn't it?
South Carolina is a weird place. It is.
But it's fascinating what you're saying because we traditionally think of South Carolina as a very violent place. It's a civil war everywhere, but it's more focused. Seems to be in South Carolina with the Loyalists and the different regiments and partisans down there. But it's interesting this very beginning stage that you're talking about
Mhm.
is very different.
Yeah, and one other thing on the snow campaign also is in the same way that like Trenton and Princeton spurs Washington to think about formalizing prisoner administrative structures, the snow campaign does that for South Carolina. And so when those prisoners do make it back to Charleston, there is an effort to establish a committee that would actually go and look into the treatment of prisoners, not just prisoners of war, but also loyalists. And that's one thing as well that I wanted to touch on, which is where we see the strict delineation in the North between you are a state prisoner and you are a loyalist or you are a military prisoner, right? So state being loyalist prisoners and military being prisoners of war you're captured in a British uniform or in a German uniform and you're allied to the British Army. We don't see that same strict delineation in the South. And so with that, there is this notion that everybody is just kind of, if you're against the patriot cause, you're against the patriot cause in South Carolina. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly, whether or not that remains consistent for the entirety of the war or what it indicates about the way that South Carolinians conceived of the cause. But frequently prisoners are put together in the same spaces. They're not separated. When we see South Carolinians talking about the Loyalists in 96, they refer to them as His Majesty's Militia, which to me is indicative of trying to kind of other them and make them something other than what they had been previously, which was just, provincial militiamen. And there's an attempt to sort of put distance between the Patriots and those Loyalist militiamen. So there's a lot of interesting things going on, with language as well, where they're not trying as hard to keep things separate and orderly in that way. Whereas in the North, they're very preoccupied with making sure those categories are separate.
All right, lots of stuff here. So we're gonna wrap up here shortly, but one thing we always ask authors and historians, um, it's an easy question for you. I'm sure you have lots of answers to this, but when you're doing this research, was there anything that kind of surprised you, something you did not expect to find that maybe changed how you perceived one of these topics of history, and you were researching it, you had your mindset on something, and then it was totally changed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that the involvement of women was something that I thought I would have to really kind of dig for.
Hmm.
Um, but I didn't. I found women in almost every single corner of this research, whether again that is women who choose to enter captivity with their husbands and then are experiencing captivity, or if it's women who are in host communities and are the ones boarding out the Trenton officers, for example, or if it's women who live close to, again, detention sites, barracks, and are providing food and sustenance for prisoners to supplement their rations, women who are doing business with prisoners or who are hiring prisoners who are allowed to be bounded out. I mean, they are just in almost every corner of this research. And even women who were not in North America during the conflict still are involved by letter writing and by trying to advocate for their captive husbands, or sons or brothers by letter writing and trying to get in touch with the powers that be. Frequently, there's a perception of just sort of going straight to the top, and the Howe brothers are the ones that you should talk to, or Washington is the one you should talk to, and then they end up having to get sort of passed off onto the subordinate authorities like Elias Boudinot and his deputies, and their letters will sort of filter down that way. But a lot of those letters do exist, especially in the records of the Department of Prisoners and in Elias Boudinot's personal records that are saved in a variety of different archives. So I've seen them at Library of Congress, but there's also a couple at American Philosophical Society, and elsewhere. So that was probably my biggest surprise, was finding that women were very involved in this, and women were especially active in an area that we didn't touch on because I didn't cover it in this most recent chapter, but in prisoner exchange,
Okay.
because prisoner exchange was something that again really eluded the Americans and the British for the duration of this conflict because neither side could quite agree what the other was. The British did not want to concede the question of American independency, and again, to conduct a prisoner exchange a la 1758 is going to be conceding the question of American
Right.
independency. And so for that reason, but also Congress really wants its money back for the money that it's already spent for the states that the states have already spent on prisoners by the time we get to the middle years of the war. So congressional representatives are also bringing their own intransigence to the table and are also delaying exchanges. What we start seeing instead is that the states are exchanging prisoners, and this is an area where women are very active. Is that they'll be writing to the governor of their state and telling the governor the story of their son or their husband or their brother who was captured, where he is, how long he's been in captivity, try to kind of build a case, and then we'll continue to write and petition to try to get their husband, brother, father released from British captivity. And so that's one area where women have a good deal of influence during the conflict, and are often successful actually in achieving the exchange of their loved ones. So that's something that I did not expect to find. I found a lot of, and is certainly going to play a big role in the book when it comes out.
I was going to say that's definitely needs to be highlighted. Um, Speaking of books, so I know you're working on one, but at this moment, if our viewers or listeners are interested in learning a little bit more about some of this, what are some of the you've been mentioning books through our talk, but we can wrap up with just a couple of books you'd recommend or places you recommend people to find more about it, read more about this.
Yeah, so the one that I keep going back to is an excellent one, especially if you're interested more in administration, which is my area of focus. But if you're interested in violence in the war, T. Cole Jones's Captives of Liberty is an excellent text. If you are particularly interested in German prisoners, you would be very well to look at Ken Miller's Dangerous Guests,
Hmm.
which I believe came out in 2011. And then one more that's quite good also on the German prisoners is Daniel Krebs' Merciful Enemy, which is just about the way that Germans are experiencing captivity and gets into that question that you asked us earlier, Rob, about the prisoners who stayed. So he tries to trace out those stories as well, and the integration of German prisoners in especially sort of mid-Atlantic communities in Pennsylvania and the surrounding colony states. So those three books are kind of the trifecta. Hopefully my forthcoming text joins them. I also have a really great overview article for people who are educators and want to kind of get both sides of the story, British and American prisoners. I wrote the Oxford Encyclopedia of American History article on that topic, which is available on their website. So those are 4 options for you, one of which is from yours truly.
And we'll put those on the chat so when people watch, they can find those linked really easily.
Great.
Well, this has been great. And also too, I'd be remiss that I was reading, I didn't know you were doing this, but I should have. You're doing the Frontier War booklet for the Center Military History, or is it already done?
It's in post-production, so hopefully that's coming out in the winter. You and I are, of course, recording this in the midst of the shutdown, so we'll see
Right, yeah, I
how that
know.
affects the timeline. But yes, co-author on the Frontier pamphlet, so very
Great.
excited for that one to
No,
come out.
that's a good series. I picked a bunch of the ones that have already come out when we were at the Army Museum for the conference back in the spring now. Time flies, doesn't it?
Really
So
does.
looking forward to seeing that too. That's a good series, and for anyone watching, when those come, if you haven't seen those are free. They're produced by the Army, the Center of Military History, and they're very well done, very excellent, good maps, good overviews. So look forward to seeing that.
Online and in print, so we can have that link in the show notes too.
That's right. That's right. I'll do that too. All right, Brent. Well, thank you for joining us, and let's stay in touch as the book comes out. May have you come back on when the book comes out to help promote the book. Good luck out in Omaha, and don't get too cold out there in the Nebraska winter. But thank everyone for watching and joining in. And like I said, I'll put these books in our chat here so you can catch those, and look forward to seeing your book soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Right.